Welcome to 50/50 Books, the book review podcast where the books are split in two, and figuring out just what is going on is always a toss-up. I'm Taylor.
And I'm Jonathan.
And this episode, we're just finishing up The Midnight Library by Matt Haig.
So, we can start talking more on the book at large, and the second half of the book at large, of course. But now that we're at the end, there's some questions that I still had as far as the way the Midnight Library works, or kind of just more in general the way this kind of parallel universe thing works. So one thing I was wondering, and we touched on it lightly in the last episode, but do we think that there's that it would even be an option for more than one version of Nora to be a slider at the same time? Because I think that would be a little confusing if they're trying to fight for the same lives. But I could also see, because Nora is still who Nora is across universes, that she may find herself in a pretty similar position across several lives.
No, I think I found the answer to this question that you had. Early on, Mrs. Elm in the library talks about, the original Nora. And, Mrs. Elm basically says Nora is between lives right now, but if you lose that will to carry on, it'll affect your root life, your original life, and that could lead to the destruction of this place. You'd be gone forever, you'd be dead, and so would your access to all of this. So I think the destruction of the library indicates, this original root life Nora is the only one that has access to this.
Do you think that implies that the other Noras would cease to exist with this Nora?
I think it's a possibility. Because I think if we take the tree metaphor and run with it, if she's the root life and, the main part of this tree, if she goes, then the tree dies, is kind of how I'm imagining this.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
My interpretation of it really plays into what I think the Midnight Library is, which is it's not actually parallel universes. It's more like the how do I want to describe this? It's more like a dream. It's all connected to Nora, this original Nora, and so it doesn't necessarily have to be real outside of Nora, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. How I think the only thing that stops me from being fully on board with that is Nora comes back into her root life and legitimately knows things that she learned from her other lives that exist in the world she's in.
Oh, I guess that's true.
Right, she looks up Ingrid and is like, oh, that's cool, she's out there doing research, and she's like, yeah, Joe, you should totally go for you, and that's your dude, you know? So I think there is a implied reality to what she's doing. It does make me wonder what even is the parallel universe concept here, because is it simply just that she's creating new lives by making decisions, right? The idea that her life splits into two every time she makes a binary decision, or is it these parallel universes have always been side by side, you know? And I think in this book, the idea is that it splits off into two, but that doesn't necessarily mean that because those lives depended on her creating them, that they couldn't outlast her. To me, it's okay, she created them and that's that, you know, they're in existence and they're on their own. They're their own thing now.
Right. I guess even if you have rotted roots or a dead tree, it doesn't necessarily disappear. It can still exist. Which I guess those lives could still exist.
Yeah, it's like a graft. You take a piece of the tree that's really kind of still alive.
So I think, to mesh the two ideas, it's kind of the power is contained to this original Nora, but she's not, in control of sustaining those other lives. They are just actual other realities. I think the intent of the Midnight Library and the video store with Hugo is you're supposed to choose your root life. But also, in her last life, she does start to gain the memories of that life. So I guess you technically, within the universe, could choose another life. But at least thematically, Nora could not have chosen any other life but her own.
Right.
Or if she did, going back to what I said in the first episode of this, if she did, she would have forgotten her root life and just become the Nora of that world, finding some place to land, like Mrs. Elm says in the beginning of the book, but it still would have been the death of Nora of that original life because she's becoming somebody else. Before we dive too deeply into Nora, though, and what she has going on, there are still some more things about the book in general we can talk about.
Yeah, for me, it's and I think this goes for books in general, of course, but it's a framework of thinking about life or thinking about whatever the book has presented to you. Wow, I feel like I've said this in an episode before, but that's what it is. It's a framework for thinking as opposed to a directive, right? And I think you're totally right that it's about perspective. I feel like that's going to come up a lot as we talk about this book. It should give you just something new to think about and a new way to approach either your life or just, books alone, or maybe the way you interact with other people. But it should never be like this book is telling me to do this thing. It's more of this is what I got out of reading this book. And I think the reviews that treat it like a self-help book, I think if you're treating it like a self-help book, you're probably not going to like this book unless you are Nora, unless you're feel like you are exactly Nora and you're going to get the same exact thing out of it that she did. Whereas I think the greater thing is getting out of it, like what I get out of it, I guess, uniquely is seeing Nora's change in perspective throughout the book and think, okay, the thing I can take out of that is not, I need to have the same perspective shift as her, but that I as a human can have a perspective shift if that's something I would benefit from, and could think about that through the lens of this book and the journey that Nora goes on.
Sometimes you just need things said to you, or you just need to say things. You need the lesson to be clear. And maybe some people will think that's childish or it lacks subtlety. But I'm like, why does it need to be subtle? Why does it need to be artful? And also when you're dealing with this theme of perception and a character who has thought everybody in her life hates her and doesn't need her or doesn't appreciate her, sometimes you need the very clear answer given. You need, quote unquote, the slap in the face. No, you're looking at this wrong. Because if she had just not killed herself for a little bit longer, Joe calls her. He's hello? And then later Izzy texts her yeah, we should definitely talk, actually talk, because Izzy, clearly knows something's going on. But she's also on Australian time. So it's when, what's the time difference here? What are we working with? And I think it's I don't know. It's a simple book, but I think it's supposed to be simple because to become complex and to try and be artful and subtle, it just complicates things. And
yeah,
you need it to be clear, especially for a character like Nora. And there's nothing wrong with that.
I think it would be almost dangerous to try to overdo this book. I really appreciate the book is on the more direct side and more straightforward in its structure and layout and the way that Nora communicates to the reader. I really, really appreciate those things because the book is still about something kind of deep and heavy, right? It's about depression and suicide. What I don't need on top of having to when I go down, when I sit down to read The Midnight Library at the end of my workday, I don't want to be held back from reading it because I'm oof, not only do I have to think about depression and suicide for the next hour that I'm sitting here reading, but I also have to deal with the complicated nature of this book. That would make things too much, I think. I think it needs to be laid out simple in order to access the people who would benefit from reading this book.
Right. And it's also simple but not, it's general, but also very personal. Because I think another issue when you talk about these types of topics is people want all the answers. It has to encompass every single aspect of the thing you're talking about. I think this also comes up when you talk about, queer storylines. You need to include every single queer storyline you can have for it to be proper representation. And it's it can just be, a personal thing that might not make complete sense and might not represent everyone, but it represents, some people. And I think that's fine.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things I love about it is it's pretty raw and direct, right? We get all of those Nora monologues with the Olympics athlete speech in the podcast, and it's this is just straight up how Nora is feeling and experiencing her experiences. There's not a lot of beating around the bush. And while we don't get the internal thoughts like we talked about on the last episode, we definitely get emotional discussion, raw emotional discussion, and that's the part of the book that should feel the most complicated, and I think it is the part that feels the most complicated, and it doesn't feel complicated. It makes it a bit easier to discuss and process, and that's what this needs. I guess this also loops back into the self-helpy thing we were talking about earlier, but you really do have to take this book as one person's story and not fully widely representative of people who are experiencing depression or suicidal ideation, right? You have to take this as we are in a sense, like lucky to be learning the deep thoughts of this fictional person who is experiencing something really, really tough, and think about the ways that we react to it, and not think about, is this me, or like how is this going to fix my problems, right? You have to think about it as like we're getting a little blip in the big literature about people who experience depression and suicidal ideation. We're not getting the entirety of depression and suicidal ideation. And I wish I could encourage people who would read this in the future to not go into it with that mindset. I think I could understand not liking the book going in with that mindset. I'm glad I didn't go in with that mindset that it was going to like fix my problems or help me out in a certain way. I know like it's probably more sensitive for people who are experiencing things similar to Nora, but I would hope that people could go into it more of an open mindset of like, of I'm just going to learn something by reading this. I'm not going to fix anything necessarily. And if I do, like, I'm lucky for that. It's not the expectation.
Right. It's also like needing to have empathy. Like, no, it's not your situation, but it's a situation.
I think there's the one thing this book doesn't do that I kind of wish it did do, because it would solve its own problem, is create that empathy. I kind of think you need to have some of that empathy going into it. Or again, if you are a person who has that sort of empathy going in with the mindset of like, I need to lean into the empathy part of myself, right? But it would be nice if there was something that got you a little bit more on board for that. I don't know exactly how that would get delivered, though. Of course, like the author can't teach the world empathy, but
right.
That's what's missing here, is like having people go in with the mindset of like, of thinking about someone else and thinking about someone else's situation and context, even if they might see things that relate to their own.
If you can just find like one aspect that you liked, it doesn't even have to be like, you don't have to have mental health issues to like this book. You can be fine and still be like, actually, maybe I am looking at this thing wrong. Or maybe I'm not appreciating the people in my life more. Or maybe I should try these things. Or maybe I should go back to a thing that I stopped doing and try it again. And like, I don't know. I feel like fiction, even if you can't connect entirely, there's still like at least one little aspect. And I think the issue is people are so desperate for representation in all things, and they want to be represented, that we've kind of like lost the patience to find those small things because we want everything. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I would love more representation, like ace representation and like non-binary representation and all that stuff. But I can still find myself connecting to and like appreciating characters and storylines that don't have those things, or like connecting those wants that I have to things that don't necessarily fulfill those needs that I have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is making me think that like maybe one way we're like failing in the way we teach kids about reading and English literature is when we get into the weeds a little bit when you get to like high school level English, which is good and fine and fun. But one thing I think we should always do a little bit more of when it comes to reading a new book is kind of checking in with yourself before you read the book and say like, how am I feeling right now? And like, what sort of things are important to me in my life? And then after you read the book, thinking about, okay, has that changed? Are there ways that this book has like made me look at something differently with the things that are important to me? Like using books is a little bit more of a reflective tool too, right? Like what's the reason we're reading? Like why did I want to read this book? Do I feel like I got anything out of this book? Was it just fun? Was it something deep? Like I guess like emphasizing for ourselves what the value in reading in our lives is. So that way when we go into books like this, we are less, how do I put it? Like putting less on the author and just a little bit more on like our own interactions and reactions to the books.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Because I mean, studying English, it's really just about scholarly analysis. Like you're not taking literature as like you're taking the entertainment and enlightenment part of literature and throwing away the entertainment. Who gives a fuck if you enjoyed the book? And for the enlightenment part, it's not about personal enlightenment and reflection. It's more about like scholarly enlightenment and like what it's saying about the world at large, or even just like what it's saying about literature of that time period, whatever. But it's like not personal. Like you're not making it about yourself or like trying to connect with it in any way. And maybe that's where like certain reflections of this book are coming up, of like people trying to set it in a genre that they think it belongs in, or like thinking it should be doing more, for the world, but it's like it doesn't need to be for the world. It can just be a very personal experience. And whether you connect with that experience or not, I mean, that's up to you. But you don't have to connect to all of it, and you don't have to connect it to everything. It does not have to be everything everywhere all at once. Which, I watched that movie because John said we should, and it was great, and I cried. And that and this book definitely go together. So if you have not seen that movie, please do.
That's a high recommend. Especially, there's two aspects, just to throw it in there. One is the parallel universes, of course, because that exists in both. But definitely, like, the emotionally wrought main character, I suppose, that is sort of experiencing something really, really deep and heavy, and it's how do I even put it? There's just a lot of complicated social relationships happening in that movie that are worth exploring. So
yeah, and also like we haven't talked about it, but like potential as a thing, very important.
Mm-hmm. Do we want to dive into some more of the questions or thoughts we had about the way we feel the author represented depression and suicide in this book?
I definitely want to touch on the cure part of it, for sure. But what do you want to start with?
I guess one of the big things we seem to have as a thread here in our notes is the idea of romanticizing, which maybe we've touched on a little bit, but not so directly, of whether or not this book romanticizes. I think some people criticize it and saying it does.
Right. I think the author does a very good job with making Nora and Hugo very different. Because Hugo, even though I have my issues with his characters, he just has like an aneurysm, and he's the one that really enjoys sliding. So for the first half of the book, I was worried about like romanticizing suicide. Like, you get to do all these cool things and all of that. And like Nora does that later, sure, but she never feels at home. Like, she never feels like herself. And I think there's like a quote in the book of like, you find yourself in like so many Noras that you don't feel at home or something like that. I don't know. And she feels like a fraud. And I think the author really going into that of how Nora still isn't finding a place and she's still not finding fulfillment. It doesn't romanticize the Midnight Library and like going through this experience, because it's fun for a little bit and it's kind of exciting, but it's not living, and it's not contentness, and it's not happiness. And I think with that kind of theme and like message at the end of the book, it doesn't romanticize what Nora went through, because she very much wants to live.
Yeah, I was just going to say that she, from the beginning, does not seem super thrilled by the Midnight Library as a concept. Like, she seems pretty resistant. And then when she talks to Hugo the first time, she's like, I don't know if the Slider life is for me. And then she does the Slider life, and she kind of comes back and is like, yep, the Slider life's not for me. So I think that's like the most direct way of not romanticizing what's happening here in this Midnight Library experience. And I think the idea that like someone that you might think this is romanticizing because you think someone might try to go through with a suicide attempt because they may have some sort of life-changing experience by doing so is like, I don't know, kind of on the more simple reactions I think you could have to this concept. Like, I don't think that's realistic. I don't think it is really painting it as like ideal. And hopefully when you read the book, you're like, I'm so glad I don't have to do this, and I get to just read about someone doing this and maybe get something out of it by not having to experience it myself.
Yeah, Nora choosing to live at the end and like saving herself, basically. The message from that is like, if she had just waited a little bit longer, people would have reached out for her, and that's what she would have needed. And so like, it's not even she needed to go through what she went through, I think. I mean, it helped. It really, like, you know, drove the point home that, like, yeah, not everything is as terrible. Like, you know, it is about perception. But it just, the book, I think, fixes that problem on its own. I think it does that for a lot of negatives you could find in its depiction. I mean, I think we've mentioned at some point, like, while the book is teaching a lesson, she's mentioning that not everything is, like, perfect. This isn't, like, a perfect life. Not everything is fixed. And I think that plays into the idea of a cure. Like, going back to me mentioning, the author does a good job of dealing with any issues he might create in regards to romanticizing or trying to produce a cure. Like, he's not saying Nora's cured. And sure, he could maybe drop a line about, like, she might have a down at some point because, ebbs and flows. But I also feel like it's not necessary. Like, you can end the book on a very hopeful, positive note. And us with mental health issues might be like, yeah, it might not last. Like, she might go through it again. But we don't need that said to us. I feel like it's understood. And also, books can just have happy endings. I feel like we've drifted from that concept for some reason. It can just end happy and be good, but not perfect. And it's not trying to be a perfect ending. So I don't think it's saying all of her problems are fixed. She still has problems. She just
totally
has like
agree.
a support system now, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, it very much seems like the book isn't trying to say she's perfect happy now. Like, I think it is that. I think it's a happy ending, and it's a happy ending of this story. Like, if Nora's life in our head goes on, like, of course she's going to struggle with more things, and maybe she'll have super low lows again, and that's what happens in life, and that's okay. But that's not what the story is telling us. That's not what the story is about. The story is about this situation and about how this situation ends. And even like the way the outlook she has at the end is presented doesn't leave me feeling like she's cured either, because she's saying things like, I'm just happy to be alive. Like, I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. I have no job. I have no cat. Like, all of those things are still true. I just have a different perspective. And, she's like, maybe I will ask Ash out. Maybe I won't. Like, it's like nothing is like, wow, like everything's going to be perfect now. It's very realistic as an ending to me, while still being a happy ending.
Yeah. But talking about Nora, I thought she was great in how, like, ordinary she was. I don't know. She was just like a normal gal that we always appreciate, but not boring, because she has, like, interests and hobbies and, like, things she wants to do. And is it unrealistic that she becomes great at so many things? I don't think so. Like, she was established in the beginning as a character who had a lot of talents, and I mean, who cares if, she got into the Olympics? I mean, I'm not saying who cares that she did this great thing. I'm saying, like, who cares if the author decided to place her in the Olympics or have her band touring in Brazil and, like, around the world? Like, I think it just really leans into that point of the big things don't matter so much. It is in the small things and, like, finding happiness in those small things. But those were things she liked, because even in the Australia life, she still swam. And even in her root life, she taught piano. She's thinking about playing a bit more. Like, these are just things that are important to her. The scale of which she accomplishes these things, I think, is it adds to the lesson being taught, at least for her, but it's, like, inconsequential to her character or whether she's a good character or not.
I think our generation experienced a lot, maybe this is just because of where we came from, but like a lot of, you need to be exceptional, and go out and do the biggest thing, not even just big things. I feel like that was just like a narrative a lot of us got, being from kind of being from a town that doesn't really have a lot going on and things, like you gotta go like do big things, fix the world, stuff like that. And I think that makes it really great to read a book like this, where it's like, no, like, it's really like a big task to be ordinary. It's like a big task to live your daily life, choose to live your daily life, and do things like invest in your own interests and hobbies. Like, that takes a lot of work, So I think it's a great value to this book that Nora, in her root life, is just trying to figure it out, and not one of those things that she is in her other life, and that she doesn't even seem to necessarily want those things when she goes back to her root life too. Like, really, it is the little things. And like, I did actually like leave our hometown to go off and do other things, but that wasn't because I felt like I needed to be like a certain thing at a certain point. It's really all just a journey in finding one's own, like, happiness, or even like not even that far, but just like one's own preference of how to live. There's a lot in here about Nora feeling like, I should have been in the labyrinths because, like, it would have made my brother happy and Ravi happy, and like, I should have gone to Australia because it would have made Izzy happy. So like, it does lead to this conversation of like, how does all of this stuff that society tells us we should do, or feelings, external pressures, and the way we perceive how our actions make other people feel about us affects our own happiness, right? Like, that's kind of what Nora struggles with here. So it's interesting to discuss that and think about what are the ways that that's true for me, right? Like how is it that I've done things to please other people as opposed to myself? How have I found happiness either in doing those things or in just choosing not to do those things? Yeah, there's just a lot to think about on from a reflection standpoint for each individual person who reads this book.
Yeah, because it's like the things you do, but also the degrees you do them to. Because sure, she doesn't want to tour the world and be like a big rock star. Or, well, we don't know like how her life was in that, but at least our root Nora wasn't happy with that really. Mostly probably because she didn't have memories. We can talk about that later, but also Joe was dead, which was like a real bummer. Yeah. But she doesn't need to do the big rock star thing. She can just do what she might do at the end of the book, which is just like play music, maybe post something online. Who knows? And it might not go anywhere, but you can still do it and enjoy it. And also, I think we talked about this or at least I did in the first episode when Neil fires her because he's a dickhead. Your whole life doesn't have to be the thing you enjoy. Like, it'd be great if we could all do the thing we love and just that. But you can work and support yourself and then still do the thing you like. Like, you shouldn't hate your job. That would be awful. It makes you miserable. As somebody who hated their, like, previous job, for the most part, because of people. But I still found, like, I shifted my perception. I was like, this is not my life. And I worked on the things that I wanted to be my life. And they might not go anywhere, but I'm having a great time doing those things. And I think that's enough.
No, I'm on the same page. Yeah. Okay.
So as someone who liked to be contradictory, I loved Thoreau in high school. I was like the only person. But Thoreau means a lot to Nora in this book. And his quote, like, it's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. It just does it for me, you know? It's just good. But it kind of goes into where we really start to understand Nora as an unreliable narrator, and not in like a negative way in which she's like the villain or whatever, but just we are seeing this through her personal experience, and so the perception she has of other people is going to be skewed. And I think it just makes a really good point of like sometimes we take advantage of point of view in fiction and we like trust the narrator too much. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I feel like most people play with it very intentionally, but with this kind of book about these relationships, it just becomes a lot more important. So we start the book and we're kind of like, wow, she really has nobody, huh? Like, nobody's gonna be there for her. Like, what is this? And we get to the end of the book and we're like, oh, actually.
Yeah, totally.
She does have people.
It's so true. I feel like I fully accepted, like, wow, like, she really is just in the pits of the pits at the beginning of the book. And therefore, like, she couldn't possibly have anyone who's, like, looking out for her. And, you know, Izzy feels this way about her. Joe feels this way about her. Like, taking it as fact. Yeah. I think, yeah, it was interesting. You know, I love Joe as a character in this book and the way he gets portrayed. Even though the way he gets portrayed, I think, antagonizes him a lot, right? Like, the way he is presented in lives where he's alive is like kind of maybe like disregarding Nora or like not loving towards Nora, but also the people we get that information from are people we don't know and don't have that sort of trust for. But Nora kind of just has to be on board because she's new in this life, right? Like, she has to just kind of take things for what they are. And then, of course, in her root life, too, she also has her own perception of what Joe is like that gets pretty quickly, like, disambiguated when he starts talking to her at the end of the book. So it's just interesting how, like, I low-key hated Joe for a lot of this book because of the way he was talked about. And it took not 2 paragraphs for me to have a total mindset shift, just because it was limited to a certain subset of perception from a certain subset of people.
Yeah, like, we kind of get him in the Olympic life, and he can come across as, like, dismissive or maybe not caring that she's going through something, but also, like, how would he know? Like, he's working with a Nora he didn't know before, like, it's a different version of his sister. Mm-hmm. And he's not being overly affectionate, but he's also not being completely cold. He's just being normal. He's being a normal guy.
And he's also low-key not being her brother in that moment, you know? Like, he's kind of doing his job.
Mixing business and personal life can have issues.
Exactly.
But there's no reason for him to think anything is necessarily wrong in that moment until, like, she gives her speech, and then by then it's like she's out of there, so who knows what happens.
Yeah.
But because of what Robbie says at the beginning, like, no wonder your brother didn't want to talk to you. You left the band, you piece of shit. Like, we kind of are thinking that's what's actually going on.
Right.
Which was, we all were like, what the fuck is Joe doing here? Like, we were not for it. I definitely wasn't.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, pro Joe.
Yeah.
Love that guy. And then same with Izzy. Like, not that she was necessarily, like, disconnected. We just didn't know enough about her.
Yeah. We don't really see her, so.
I think it was just because she was in Australia and, like, they're in the UK. Like, there's some time difference that needs to be factored in. But also, sometimes you just don't talk to people. And that doesn't mean you stop being friends. It's just, like, a different kind of friendship, I guess.
Yeah, I think Izzy is allowed to not be the same friend that she was before she went to Australia. Like, I think it's fair that things change when that happens, and like things just change in life. Like, it's so true. Like, when I was in college, like, one of my close friends and I kind of had this conversation of like, one day we're probably not going to be as close as we are right now, because we're not going to live 2 blocks away from each other, and we're not going to spend all of our time hanging out with each other, and we're going to be okay when that happens, and we are, like, we still talk pretty regularly. I go visit him now and then, right? Well, now he lives on the other side of the country, so that's a little harder these days, but it's like, yeah, we're not the same friends we once were, but we're still good friends. Like, he's still someone I'm super, super close with. And when we do talk with each other, it's great, and I'm very happy by it. But there's also no expectation, So I think, in adult lives, where, especially in the modern time, where we're pretty mobile people, like, Izzy has permission to be a little bit different, and she, we see her apologize kind of after Nora comes back to her root life too, and I think like that's an okay response too, to say like, yeah, I probably should have been like a little bit more transparent, and maybe give you a little bit more time, or if not that, to at least say like, I can't give you as much time these days, and I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, I think people are allowed to get wrapped up in their lives. And I think maybe I'm just being hopeful, but Izzy mentions like coming back to the UK. So I'm like, maybe she's also realized like, oh, I really want to get closer to this person. And the best way to do that is to come back. Because she basically went to Australia on her own.
Right. And she was hoping Nora would come, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if she was hoping she would come, but yeah, I think so. She at least offered.
Shall we talk about the Book of Regrets?
Yeah.
And I know we'll talk about the end later, like the the whole experience where the book disappears later on, but like, I think the idea of the book being burnt away is less so of like, and there goes the rest of the regrets, and more of like well, does the Book of Regrets really matter for where I am now? Like, I'm ready to go back into the life, and I have kind of a new perspective. So while I might still have some regrets, and I'm probably going to realize that my regrets are different than they were before I had this experience, I don't really need that Book of Regrets to manage it,
Right. Like, she doesn't need to be tied down by those regrets anymore. Or use them as a kind of directory.
Yeah, and it's not like a journey of like undoing now,
Right.
It's like a journey of newness. And maybe that's important, right, for her to have gotten through all of those and still feel the way she was feeling. Like for her to have gotten through, like, quote, undid all of her major regrets and still feel like, but this still isn't right, like, I am not feeling the happiness I thought I would feel just because I have less regrets, which I think is right, like, I think it's less about eliminating regrets as it is having a full kind of mindset shift like she does, so I think it makes sense that she gets rid of most of them and still does that.
I think it's a way of really saying, and this could be considered subtle storytelling here, but Nora has basically been focused so much on the past, like how she's affected people in the past and what she should have did in the past, and she's finally reached this point where it's like, it's time to just live, like, very, not necessarily planning out her entire future, but being, I think, very much in the present and being hopeful for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I did think it was interesting that the outside life did affect her ability to stay in the life with Ash, because I guess in that case, like, time did start moving when she came back to the Midnight Library, but like the thing that had me held back on the outside life affecting her experience was that time wasn't moving. So I don't know, it's just interesting the way that that's portrayed, of like, time's not moving, but like Nora's also like having all these experiences and like, edging back and forth between life and death. I don't know. I guess like one thing I'm kind of happy about is I don't think the author like went too hard on trying to explain how that worked, because I think we've seen other situations where the author goes too hard on trying to explain how a thing works, and then it creates plot holes and things. So But yeah, it was kind of sad to think of it as like, oh, like she really doesn't have control over what's happening here anyway. Like at the end of the day, like her root life is really kind of controlling her. And I don't know, like she could just die and none of this would matter.
Yeah, I feel like she spent a long time in the life with Ash, but the issue was she couldn't settle into it. Like she has to keep repeating to herself, "This is a good life. Like this is a good life." And it's like, if you keep saying that, I'm not going to believe you. Like, clearly something is wrong. And
she's trying to convince herself for sure.
Right. At first, I didn't like the fire kind of pulling her out because I thought it was making the choice for her.
Right.
Instead of her coming to the realization on her own. But I think if the library and Mrs. Elm are her, then she made the choice. And also, I think sometimes you don't have the realization or you don't logic your way through the problem. Sometimes it just kind of clicks for no reason at all. Or as I mentioned before, you do kind of get that slap in the face and it's like, hey, this actually not what you think. Like, we're done here. Like, no more, we're not doing this anymore. And I think that's kind of what the fire serves as. Like her own self kind of being like, it's not working out. It's over. Like, you need to make a choice. Because, like, how long would she have just persisted thinking, this is fine, this is fine?
Right. Especially because it really was as like, good as it had been up until that point. Like, what more is there to do, truly? And she really did, like, it was interesting that she did kind of become a slider, right? Like, there's that section where she's like, the author's like, she lives this life and that life and the other life, like, very quickly and rapidly and without much say of what's actually happening in them. So she does do the thing, you know?
Yeah, I think it just portrays, like, you can do anything. It doesn't really matter because you're going to be out of there. It's not really your life. Who cares? Like, that nihilism aspect of, like, it could be very depressing because nothing matters. It could be very freeing, which is how Hugo seems to take it. Or it could just end up being, like, boring, which is... She's not necessarily feeling bored with the slider life, but, like, she's realizing this is, like, I'm not feeling like myself anymore. Like, something needs to matter. Which I think it's true of nihilism. Like, even if the universe at large does not matter and, like, nothing matters in the end. I mean, I always lean more existential than just complete nihilism. Some things still need to matter, like, to you, even if it's just on a personal life.
Right.
They still need to have meaning. There's just no inherent meaning to those things.
Right. There's no objective. Yeah.
Right. I got very deep. Sorry.
No,
I do like philosophy, but... Like, I like The Good Place and this book, in which it's, like, very light philosophy, where I'm not getting, like, given too much information that's going to rattle my brain.
It's almost like, digestible philosophy, right? Like, I think I think we as people in general do a better job of that today than once upon a time, but that could also just be because of cultural differences between now and the past, but of, like, delivering our thoughts on thinking in a way that makes sense to the average person. Like, I think the various forms of media we have, like, television, like, really help with that, and, like, fiction for that matter. I don't know, like, reading nonfiction philosophical thinking can be tough.
Yes. So yeah, she had to, like, go to the only book that was still there that would not burn down, I guess, which was her root life, but she had to write in it.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting that this is the only book she needed to, like, actively participate in. Like, the other ones she's just kind of stepping into because they were, like, yeah, already written, but they're also not hers. This one is hers, and she needs to make the choice. You have to choose every day to do the thing. I don't know what else. What does she write in the book? You may be asking. Well, you shouldn't be asking because you've read the book with us clearly. But she tries a couple different things. Like, Nora wants to live. Nora wants to do these things, and it's like, okay, but you're Nora, so I don't know why you're writing about this other Nora. And then eventually, it's like, I am alive.
She has to claim it. Yeah.
It gave very Detroit Becomes Human energy.
Yeah.
Just in that line, like, I don't know. It didn't actually. Just that line made me think of it in this moment. Because I think that's something that comes up in that game, too.
Yeah.
Like, the androids being like, we are alive.
Like,
that kind of
ownership.
Sentiment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of those scenes at the end, she hops on her piano and is like, I want to do this more. And, like, there's, like, a tune coming to me. And I'm going to, like, make it a thing. Do we think that she's gonna write the song from her band life?
How specifically? I don't think so, because I think the podcaster mentions like that was about an agent she had and like feeling betrayed. I think it'll be something, I don't know, lighter than that, similar to like the song she mentions like throughout the book, the one with the sky or whatever it's called.
Wow, I seem to have forgotten that.
Not that song specifically. I think it's already written, but similar energy, I think.
Okay. I wasn't sure if it was a callback, because one thing I noticed too, remember how last episode I got super confused thinking that the author told us something like secretive and Nora didn't know, and I was totally wrong about that. The author did put the lyrics of Howl in, and presumably Nora did not have that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was super interesting.
I'm sure you could explain it as like, oh, maybe she catches the memory before she leaves, blah, blah, blah. I don't care enough to explain it. It's fine that it happened.
Yeah. No, I think it's okay that there's something we get that Nora doesn't.
Yeah, I think if the library persists as its own, not necessarily that it persists as its own entity, but this concept of people having a library is a thing that is actually in reality, then maybe there is somebody controlling it. And maybe that is the author, and maybe they decided, hey, this is how, and we're going to include this in Nora's story. I don't know. You could get deep with it. I don't think you need to. It's there.
I think it was more of just like for fun to like include.
Yeah.
That.
I think it was funny that the podcaster was like, this is all the terrible stuff that's happened to you in this life.
Yeah.
Let me just lay it all out.
Bold.
But he was like, you've had so much shit to deal with these past few years. Stalkers, bad managers, the fake feuds, the court case, the copyright issues, the messy breakup with Ryan Bailey, the reception of the last album, rehab, the incident in Toronto, the time you collapsed from exhaustion in Paris, personal tragedy, drama, all that media intrusion. Why do you think the press hate you so much?
That question was like, I think I cackled when I read the line, why does you think the press hates you so much? Like, god dang. She was definitely going through it in that life. The thing that bothered me in this vein was that in a lot of the lives, the thing that made her unhappy wasn't really anything to do with, like, the main thing she was doing in that life, really. Like, like, Joe being dead. Yeah, like, it almost seemed like happenstance that Joe was dead. Not so much that, like, yeah, obviously her decision branched off that new life and made that eventually happen, but it's just like, why is Joe dead? Why is Izzy dead? Like, why are these the things that make this life untenable? Whereas I preferred a life where it's the thing that made the life untenable is that the thing she's involved in living is what makes her unhappy. Like, she's in an unhappy marriage with Dan. Like, that's her centered around Nora. And I know in the second half of the book, we get a little bit more of the reason why those things matter, right? Because of, like, the connection she feels with these people and the desire to love and be loved by these people, right? Like, those are important things to her. But to, like, make the reason that she's unhappy just like, well, this person's dead in this life and that person's dead in that life. Like, it just felt like a little bit of a cop-out on, like, giving some really, like, I felt like could have been some more targeted reasons why Nora might not be unhappy in those situations.
Yeah, I think it's also, like, those specific dreams were so tied to those people that she didn't have. Like, Australia didn't matter to her. It was the fact that she was supposed to be with Izzy.
Mm-hmm.
And then she ended up stuck there because she lost Izzy. And it was hard to do anything. And then for the Labyrinths, like, she likes music, but the band itself, that was always more connected with Joe than it was necessarily to her. And if he's not there to experience it, then what's the point?
Yeah, that's a good point.
There is an importance, not necessarily like basing your whole existence on the people around you, but there's nothing wrong with deciding to live because of the people you have with you.
Yeah.
And she might need those kinds of things to hold on to at least this early.
I do think you made a good point earlier too, Taylor. Like, it almost like does teach her, like, what was the reason you would have gone to Australia? What was the reason you would have done, sung in the band? Like, you would have done it for those other people because you immediately realize without those people that you don't want to do it. That you don't want to be in that situation. So I think you're totally right about that. The other thing, there's like this one quote I pulled out that said she realized she hadn't tried to end her life because she was miserable, but because she had managed to convince herself that there was no way out of her misery, which, like, I thought was such like a perfect way to, like, put into words the whole perception thing that we talked about, and perception and perspective, right? Like, this is like a new way to look at the way she looks at other people and really emphasize that, like, this what you see, right? Part of the throw thing. So I don't know. There's not much more I want to say about that quote, but I really like to put that in there. Yeah, that's kind of it.
Yeah, and you also bring up, and I feel like we've brought up a million times throughout this is not a universal experience. Like,
Yeah.
not everybody is going to feel this way, but I feel like that is just kind of how it goes for some people. Like, it's not that you want to die, you just kind of want things to stop, or you want to get out of something. And she brings up another quote, which is kind of like, it turns out the place I was trying to escape from was the place I needed to escape to, or something to that effect.
Right.
And that goes into, perspective and things like that. But it's also like, she doesn't want to die necessarily. She just wants to get away. And it's like, when you think you have nothing and, like, you lose your job and, like, you lose or think you lose all of these reasons to stick around, and, like, stress is just accumulating, and, like, there's nothing but bad things seeming to happen, and your cat just died. Yeah, you kind of just want everything to pause, which I think is very interesting when you think about the Midnight Library and the fact that it is a pause in time.
Right.
Like, time does not move there. I mean, until it does, and she has to make her choice. And she goes on like, oh, I want to die, like, I want to do this and this and this, and then it's like, actually, and again, not universal, but, like, actually, she doesn't want to die. She just did not want to be where she was. Like most people, she wants to be happy. Like, that's it, And she just didn't have anything in her root life, or she thought she didn't have anything that would make her happy.
Yeah, this sort of book, like, it almost makes me... This book could have been... How do I put this? Nora could have been one of several different types of people, and she just happens to be this type of person, right? Like, I guess this is dwelling on this isn't speaking on behalf of, like, an entire community, right? But it does make me, like, wish almost like this. It makes me wish we had more of this in literature, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And I feel like I learned a lot about myself and just the world reading this, and I think that there's so many perspectives that are not represented in this book that I would love to see in literature and look for because I read this book.
Yeah, like, I think you mentioned, or at least you put in the notes that you wanted Joe's story.
Yeah.
And of course, we could go into, like, diversifying and things like that, but just on a small scale. Like, he goes kind of into what he was going through and why he was kind of disconnected. And it's like, yeah, this story is about Nora, but other people have their own lives and stories going on. And that's completely valid. Like, the fact that Joe kind of doesn't want to talk to anybody, and he's going through it, and he had, his trouble with alcohol and, like, all of that stuff. That doesn't make him a bad brother. That just makes him a human who is having an issue.
Yeah, and it just, like, speaks on the greater mental health issue in the world, right? Like, when, how can Nora feel supported if everyone in her life is also experiencing mental health problems, right? It's a lot harder to find the network, the support network, when everyone is struggling, so that's why it needs that the mental health struggles that two people go through are greater than the individual ones that each of them are going through if they're in each other's support network. Nora didn't feel super supported by Joe, but Joe, like, wasn't feeling super supported in his life and hadn't maybe in a long time. So it's really hard to go through this stuff together, societally. And I think Joe was a really good example of that. I was, like, really excited by literally the 2 paragraphs Joe gives us about the way he was feeling and, like, what he was going through. And it was a really good way to make a complex side character. Honestly, like, we got so much out of him in that little bit that really kind of explained a lot of what we saw from him throughout the book and kind of the not so great behaviors. And not that, that would necessarily be an excuse for poor behavior, but like, we get a lot more context and learn a lot more about the things he's going through. That's why I say I want his story. It's like, he's obviously going through, like, a story's worth of things, and like, also too, just, like, getting a queer character story where it's like maybe they have gone through the things in their life, but that's not what the story is about, is really relieving. It's like, wow, like, we can, like, talk about the struggles that this queer person had, that maybe is because they're queer that those things happened, right? Because people didn't know how to handle that, without it being, like, the major plot point of the story. So like that was like pretty interesting too, and would be maybe a knock against making a whole book out of it. But like we just got so much out of him in such a brief period of time.
Right, because we also got like sibling dynamic in this. Like, what do you do when your sibling is basically the golden child?
Right.
And like, yeah, Joe wasn't completely like discredited because he could kind of do whatever he wanted, it seemed like, and he did have some support from his parents with like the music and stuff like that. But there's a difference from like having support of your parents because they're putting all this pressure on you and having the support of your parents because they don't really give a shit what you're doing.
Yeah.
Or even just in a smaller scale, having a sibling who is getting all of that attention and all that pressure, and yeah, it's making her miserable and like she's having issues of her own, but you don't really see it that way. You're just seeing attention that is not being given to you. And you're like, what am I doing wrong? Like, why? What is happening here? And it just causes, you know, issues. Yeah, because Nora makes a good point about like the piano being basically a hand-me-down and like that kind of hand-me-down lifestyle and those dreams being hand-me-down, which, oof, I don't want to get into that. But yeah, the fact that Joe was able to do whatever he wanted and like could do music, and her relationship was basically ruined with her father because she didn't want to swim, which is what he wanted for her. Yeah, it goes both ways, and it just plays into that perspective part again, which is very intrinsic to this book. But it would be interesting, not necessarily that Haig has to do this, but I feel like maybe I'm not reading the right books, but I kind of would like more sibling stories. Sometimes in media, there's such an emphasis on romantic love, and I think this was the book of platonic love that I kind of wanted, or like familial love that we got with Joe.
Yeah, that's one thing I was thinking too, is like I love that one of the major themes here is like, yeah, like love in a community, like, yeah, love between siblings or between friends, and like love is a big part of what this book is about, but it's barely about romantic love, like almost not at all about romantic love with the exception of Ash. So yeah, I agree. I really love that. We're glad we got this one. This is a winner. Are we ready to move into reviews?
Yeah.
So for me, I now that we've had this discussion, I'm like reeling back on my criticisms a little bit. So I think I'm landing at like what I want to say is 4.5 stars, but of course that means I'm going to put 5 on Goodreads. And the only like reason I like docked it to begin with was because I had some issue with, or like the main reason is because I had some issue with she's not happy in a life just because someone happens to be dead in that version of that life. Kind of changed my thoughts on that a little bit with the discussion we had earlier. So I think I will leave it at 4.5 just for the point, the simple fact that it, like, I think I could be more blown away by a book, but it was pretty close. Like it really made me think a lot about life, like I said, like about myself and perspective, and like the sort of lesson that I feel like got out of it was to like kind of analyze better the perspective I have on my life right now and think about how that changes with time and like where I want that to be and make a more active choice. You know, like making the active choice of living is a tough one sometimes, but making more of the active choice to like fully live my life and decide what that actually means for me. So I feel like I got a lot out of this book, and I'm just really happy we read it.
Okay. Yeah, for me, I was originally thinking of 4-star, but I think I've kind of established a rule of my own. 5 stars for me are like, I had a really good time, like it made me laugh possibly, or something I would read a million times over, or it just like struck at a really important time in my life. And another rule, which I kind of established reading like the first 5 Percy Jackson books, is like, if I get teary-eyed at the end, it's a 5. It's a 5. And while the social media post is like a bit cringe, just the end, like, but do I want to live? Yes, 1,000 times yes. I got teary-eyed when I read that, because this book, I think, was for me. I don't know how to describe it. Like, I didn't need what the lesson was. I've kind of already figured it out. But going through it, it struck me especially. So, in a twist of fate, I will be giving this book 5 stars.
Wow.
I know.
It's our first 5.
Nobody thought it was possible. This is a 5er. It's just, yeah, I had some issues like with some of what happened in the book. I'm looking past them. I thought this was brilliant.
Made up for it.
Will I be reading all of Haig's work?
Yes. I think we should do more Haig on the podcast.
I would love to.
Yeah, I'm pro doing it, yeah.
He's just a great time.
It's an easy convince, too, because it was a very easy to read book. So, like, despite being about something so heavy, like, very easy to read, so.
It was great. Okay, so for good vibes.
Yeah.
Something I really liked, which is talking, I guess, on a literary level, as I am wont to do, is the metaphors in this book. Yeah, everything was a little, not subtle, whatever. But I liked the metaphors. I thought they were handled well. And the fact that they were kind of easy to understand, it's just, it worked in this, in a book that was, like, trying to kind of lay it all out. Because you had, like, Nora as Nora Seed, and, like, the idea of a seed being the potential, like, of a tree. And trees get brought up a lot. You have ash, which is like a type of tree, and Mrs. Elm, which is a type of tree.
I didn't even notice that.
We also had chess coming up a lot. And the first time chess was mentioned, I like rolled my eyes and I was like, oh my God, not chess. But the idea of Nora being like a pawn that has the potential to be a queen, the idea of potential was just very nice. The river was interesting, like being stuck in the middle, not being able to commit, very Nora. We loved it. The fire, I was thinking Phoenix, I was thinking rebirth, I was thinking trial by fire, I was thinking cleansing, all of these things, and cleansing and like rebirth going into the volcano and planting a forest. And I'm really rambling, but like not just a tree she's planting, but a forest, because there is so much to a life than one singular tree. And I just appreciated that. I don't know what to say.
It's funny you mentioned the chess one, because the very last note I wrote while reading this book was, damn, I don't even like chess, and I like the metaphor for her deciding her next move.
I know.
For me, I don't feel like this book came off as like a self-help book or a claim to cure, but it was still like a really well-delivered, a well-delivered exploration of what are generally dark topics. So I really appreciate the author's willingness to do that, and kind of skill in doing so in a appropriate way. I also felt like it had a pretty realistic ending. It didn't feel idealistic to me. Like we talked about earlier, it had that happy ending without being everything's good forever now. It was very realistic in the way it resolved, given that it only had like a little bit of time after she comes back to her root life in the book. So and then the last thing that I really liked that the author did was interconnect the lives without it going too crazy, right? So Ryan Bailey is like a pretty static presence in each one of the lives one way or another, which just like makes sense because obviously Nora has a thing for Ryan Bailey one way or another. So that was cute and fun without being too much. I liked that's where I feel like the subtlety came in, is in those little connections across the lives that weren't in your face, but they were there.
Yeah.
I think that's all we got.
Yeah, so that was the Midnight Library. Yeah, it was a good one.
Yeah.
As always, for any of your own thoughts and ideas or general reviews since we finished the book, there is the Twitter at 5050_books. And for next month, we are going to be doing The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley, stopping before part 4, titled Edinburgh. And hopefully we will see you there. Or not see, but, you get the idea.
Bye.